Now, I wonder if you're sentimental, nostalgic about your own past. Have you ever taken a trip to your birthplace or maybe the school halls of your youth? It seems to be something of a hallmark of the new Albanese government. Earlier this month, Jason Clare, he visited his primary school teacher as he started on his role as the new Federal Education Minister. Today, well, the Foreign Affairs Minister, Penny Wong, is in Malaysia, where she's visiting her hometown and, yes, the very school that she attended until she was 8 years of age. It's, of course, a trip which has more than sentiment to it. The trip's also been marked as a reset of Malaysia-Australia relations. To look at the possibilities of that, James Chin joins you. James is a Professor of Asian Studies at the University of Tasmania. James, welcome.
Good afternoon.
Penny Wong is not an infrequent visitor to Malaysia. Why is this trip, do you think, different?
Well, the trip is different for the very simple fact that she's the official representative of the Australian government. She's the foreign minister now. But you're quite right. She has been a frequent visitor to Malaysia. Part of it is because her brother, one of her brothers, is still living in Kota Kinabalu. But she goes to Malaysia for holidays quite often. But now she's Australia's foreign minister. Everything will be very, very different.
It is a different thing. And of course, she's joined in the federal parliament by former police officer, and I love this bit, dolphin trainer Sam Lim, and the second person with a Malaysian background in federal politics in this country. Has that attracted attention in Malaysia?
Yes, it has. So immediately after the May elections, social media in Malaysia blew up because people were really, really surprised that Penny Wong was immediately appointed the foreign minister. But as you mentioned, people were even more surprised that a retired policeman from Malaysia, Sam Lim, was elected an MP for Western Australia. So a lot of people were very surprised. And I think they were also delighted because this reinforced Australia's reputation as a place that welcomes migrants, and they look towards migrants as a source of good things for Australia.
Because the Malaysian diaspora in this country is a large body of people.
It's actually not. I mean, the diaspora in Australia is about only 130,000. They're very small compared to, say, people from Europe. So, for example, there's about 1 million people from the UK in Australia. The only difference between most of the Malaysians living in Australia now is that most of them came over as skilled migrants. In other words, most of them either studied in Australia's universities or they came over as working professionals. So that's the big difference between Malaysians and other groups.
I think 180,000 is still substantial. By the usual measure, that's 2.5 MCGs. Malaysia is, of course, it's not just people. Malaysia is Australia's 8th largest trading partner, and that's a remarkable relationship. And that trade, two-way trade, is about $25 billion. So this is a serious relationship between the two countries.
It is, but you have to remember, Australia traditionally has been close to Malaysia and Singapore for many, many years. Part of the reason is because Malaysia and Singapore were part of the British Empire. But more importantly, Singapore and Malaysia is part of the Five Powers Defence Pact. This is a security thing that goes back to the Cold War era, and it's still valid today. So every year, Australia still sends troops up to Malaysia for training under the Five Powers Defence Pact. And of course, you have to remember that hundreds and thousands of Malaysian students have gone through the Australian education system. So Malaysia and Australia relation goes back a long, long way.
How much does that old, you mentioned there, Singapore, Malaysia as part of the British Empire at one time, that colonial relationship and Australia's part in it, how much of Malaysian perception of Australia is still coloured by that, do you think?
I'm not sure it colours perception of Australia. I think with most Malaysians, they look at Australia as a very friendly country. They see Australia as a place that they can put their children to study at the university level. And also increasingly, you find that a lot of Malaysians, especially middle class or upper class Malaysians, they see Australia as a good place to buy a second home or to get residency.
today's meeting, there were serious things on the agenda. Malaysia's foreign minister expressed Malaysia's concerns about the AUKUS nuclear submarine pact, and they are long-standing concerns as far as that, going back to when that announcement was made. And Malaysia's worried about the possibility of a regional arms race when, as we know, tensions are increasing in the region. Does this strike you as this possibility, an arms race? Is that a real risk, do you think?
Well, the reality is that there's already an arms race in Southeast Asia. Southeast Asia is probably the most contentious theater for conflict to break out after North Korea. As you know, the problem with Southeast Asia is that the South China Sea controls all the trade from the Middle East to places like Japan and Northeast Asia. So all the container ships travel across Southeast Asia, whether they like it or not. So that's the reason why all the world's major powers are looking closely at what the Chinese are doing in Southeast Asia. So I'm not surprised that the Malaysian government have raised the issue. You have to remember, it's not only Malaysia that's raising the issue. I think the Indonesians are quite worried about it. The Filipinos are also quite worried about that as well.
What would those countries, what position would those countries have Australia take? Is Australia being too much of a co-protagonist with China in those rising tensions?
Well, the way the popular perception in Southeast Asia is that Australia is really playing the role of deputy sheriff to the US. So they see Australia as basically representing the interests of the West in Southeast Asia. The great fear about Australian developing nuclear technology is that they worry that this is the first step towards acquiring nuclear weapons. So, but they do understand that this is really a long-term plan. The reality is that you're not going to see any nuclear submarine in Australia for at least 15 to 20 years down the track. But this is they need to register that they're really unhappy about this, and they hope to send a strong signal, not only to Australia, but to the rest of the world that they want all this conflict kept out of Southeast Asia. So that's basically what they're doing right now.
The trade relationship, as I mentioned, is a strong one, and security is the thing that, yes, has its particular concerns. Outside of those two, or is trade perhaps the big thing that Malaysia wants to enhance in its relationship with this country?
Well, in terms of relationship, Australia and Malaysia signed a thing called the Comprehensive Strategic Partnership, CSP. So that is sort of the highest treaty level between two countries. So they're already at the very top of the tree between Australia and Malaysia. So in terms of trade, I can only see trade getting bigger and bigger. But in terms of trade in Southeast Asia, Australia is more worried about trade with Indonesia. Indonesia and Vietnam are actually Australia's target, not so much Malaysia, because Malaysia, there's really no big issues on the Australian side. But on the Malaysian side, the bigger issue is not really about trade. It's more about the fact that Malaysians and many other countries, they're facing problems with getting tourist visas for their citizens to come to Australia.
You mentioned education earlier, James, and of course Penny Wong's father took advantage of the Colombo plan back in the day, studying at the University of Adelaide. That sort of soft diplomacy of using things like education as a linking thing between countries, that's still a sort of pretty fundamental part of this relationship?
Yes, it is. But the Colombo plan was very successful, not only for Malaysia and Australia, but for many other countries that was part of the Colombo plan. But now the big thing is really not in terms of higher education. The big thing is now investments. Increasingly, Malaysia is becoming a source for skilled migrants, and a lot of capital is leaving Malaysia, and Australia is one of the leading countries that receive the capital from Malaysia.
And that issue of a skilled migrant, is that a concern in Malaysia? Is there fears of brain drain to places like Australia?
It is an issue in Malaysia, but given the political framework in Malaysia, the Malaysian government actually don't really care about migrants coming over to Australia. There is an issue of racial politics in Malaysia, and most of those people leaving Malaysia in terms of brain drain, what we call the non-Bumiputras, the non-Malays. So in some ways, the Malaysian government doesn't really care about this issue.
James, look, thanks for your time and an interesting day in the relationships between those two countries.
Thank you so much.
James Chin, Professor of Asian Studies, University of Tasmania.
Listen to more great stories that take you beyond the headlines. Ask your smart speaker to play ABC RN.